You still have to believe that the population of the world is rising, and rising very, very dramatically. And that is straining our ability to feed people. As people become more wealthy, they want to switch to diets that are, say, heavier in meat. And meat is much more resource intensive to produce than a plant-based diet. It's energy inefficient, it produces greenhouse gases, it takes a lot of land, a lot of grain, say, to raise a cow. So all of these led into our thinking. We also realized, in the sense of our institution, we're very optimistic about the ability of people to take on problems and to use research and technology and business innovation to make a dent in these. So we thought we could help. We shared these ideas with one of our alumni. We're wondering where we got our long name. Mohammad Jamil was a graduate of civil engineering at MIT. His family has done extremely well in business. He's a businessman. They are, among other things, the world's largest franchisee of Toyota vehicles, with something like 27% of the world's market, just to give you a sense of scale. And Mohammad likes to use his money to help people. He's created a poverty action lab. He's created a world education lab. He's created this lab. He has a jobs program. He's a very generous individual. So we created this institute-wide activity. I should explain what the phrase lab means at MIT. It means we have an interdepartmental organization that works across all of our schools and departments. It's really an organizing structure to connect people with problems to people with answers and to help drive our faculty to think about water and food challenges. So my role as director of J-WAFS is actually in the office of the vice president. I'm a direct report to our vice president. And my obligation is to work with every one of our 5 schools and all of the departments. At MIT, we are very strongly an engineering and science school. 80% of our undergraduate majors are engineers, for example. Most of the rest are in the sciences, some are in architecture, humanities, and business as well. And in terms of our research activity, more than half of it rotates around the School of Engineering and our engineering departments, with science picking up a lot of the rest. So our program has a very strong component of engineering in it, and many of the things that I'll mention relate to that. If I look at, if I show you, I should say, the spectrum of things that we're currently doing, our program is built around several components. We have a program that gives seed grants to researchers at MIT who have interesting new ideas that they'd like to pursue. Often these are interdisciplinary teams involving someone from, say, an engineering department working with someone from a science department, someone from the business school working with someone from urban planning, something of that nature. Because many of these problems actually can't just be solved in the silo of a single department. And as you know from everything you've heard about water, you're never just talking about a technology problem, you're never just talking about a policy problem. These things are all linked. So we have a lot of interdisciplinary work that we're sponsoring. We're working in water purification, various technologies for water supply. We are working in biotechnology for food. We are looking at, say, crops that will not require so much nitrogen fertilizer to be productive. We are looking at food safety. We do a lot of work on sensors to ensure that foods are not contaminated with heavy metals, bacteria, or viruses. We are looking at climate change, trying to nail down the models and trying to understand better what the future may bring. And we're also interested in tech transfer and business innovation. Some of our work even extends to supply chain management, and we are doing work on supply chains in both China and Senegal at this point. We have a program for research affiliates where companies can come in and work with our faculty on problems of particular interest. We have a program that's specific to helping start new businesses. So if one of our graduate students has an invention that looks very promising, it might turn into a new company, we'll give them training on business development, help them find markets, help them do assessments, and eventually help them connect with investors who might let them spin out this company. And then finally, we also work with international partners and research in various ways. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take 5 minutes or so and just illustrate some of the kinds of things that we're sponsoring and give you a sense of what it looks like And then I will talk a little bit about our student activities as well. So, maize production has an enormous role in feeding the world. It is calorically the most important crop grown, and particularly in Africa, it is the most widely grown crop by area. But also in Africa, the production of maize is principally rain-fed. It's not irrigated, and so it's very vulnerable to changes in climate, either temperature or rainfall. So one could reasonably ask, science being driven by questions, how will climate change, or how might climate change affect the production of maize in Africa? So we've been supporting a team of 2 climate scientists, actually a climate scientist and a hydrologist. Susan Solomon was the IPCC chair for 7 years. She was chair at the time the IPCC shared the Nobel Prize with Al Gore. And Ken Strepek has worked in the Upper Nile Basin for the past 30 years, working with policymakers on water availability and other things. So Ken and Susan have been looking at maize production in Africa. What they've done was they used a set of different climate models, not just one, but 5 or 6 different models run under different assumptions about emissions and controls, so different levels of warming. They simulated 122 possible climate futures, and then they linked this to an FAO model for the productivity of maize to see what might happen. Climate models are run on computers to make projections, and in this case they projected through, with a model that represented about 4 degrees C of global average temperature rise by 2100, so a high warming scenario. But in particular, climate models fluctuate. And so you can imagine you're throwing a log into a river, turbulent river. You throw the log in, it may go to one place or another. But if you throw a bunch of logs in over and over again, you'll eventually see whether the log most often goes to one particular place. And you'll also understand better how accurately you can predict the fate of the next log that goes into the river. And so this is what they did looking at climate in Africa. So let me tell you what the colors on this chart mean. The green colors represent projected increases in maize production. The orange areas represent projected decreases, some of them quite large. The areas in light gray showed little or no change, and the areas in dark gray weren't simulated. But very importantly, the areas in white showed large changes, but changes that could be either positive or negative. In other words, the model could not discriminate. The set of models could not resolve whether a rise or a fall was likely, just that big changes were possible. It's as if you were throwing a log into the river and it would go to either bank with equal probability. So there's significant uncertainty in our projection of climate. But what you can see is Central Africa seems unlikely to have significant change. It's got high rainfall. It seems to be resilient. If you look at Southern Africa, yield losses were predicted to be quite high because the area was becoming more arid. If you look in the Sahel, you actually see significant decreases, but you also see very, very high uncertainty. A lot of this is in white. We just don't know what's going to happen. And then finally, there are a few areas where the models generally predict that you will see some increase. In the Ethiopian highlands, maize production goes up because it gets warmer, and in the other 2 areas here, it goes up because you get more rainfall. So what we conclude from this is that agricultural policies have to be different for different regions, and they have to be adaptable to a range of possible futures. We don't know with sufficient certainty to decide now exactly what ought to be done. The other area that I'll highlight here is about fertilizers. So we've managed to raise the production of crops greatly with mechanization, irrigation, fertilization, and we've kept up with rising population very strongly. Food production worldwide has risen steadily with population over the last century. But these fertilizers have consequences. Take ammonia. You need to add nitrogen to cereal grains because they don't fix nitrogen effectively by themselves. And the ammonia that's used to give the plants nitrogen is largely produced by something called the Haber-Bosch process. which consumes 3% of the world's natural gas supply. It's got an enormous carbon footprint. It also runs off into waterways along with other things and promotes algal blooms. Second example is potassium. Plants need this as potash added to soils. And potash mainly comes from mines in the northern hemisphere. They're largely monopoly controlled, so the prices tend to be high. And potash is most strongly needed in the soils of the southern hemisphere, which are older and more depleted. So there's a problem getting potash affordably where it's needed. So we have the question then, can you enhance crop yield in a way that's more accessible and more environmentally friendly going forward? Three examples of this from MIT researchers that we are supporting. Chris Voigt is a biological engineer. He does synthetic biology, which means that he can synthesize large sequences of DNA, analyze and then synthesize DNA. Chris was able to find the 25,000 base pairs of DNA that allow legumes like soybeans to fix nitrogen effectively. And he's working to transfer that capacity into cereal grains. If he's successful, you won't need ammonia-based fertilizers for crops like corn or wheat, which means that you won't have the 3% of world natural gas, you won't have the runoff, and incidentally, you'll lower the cost of those grains about 25%. So if it works, it's exciting. Antoine Alenor, the next fellow, is an extractive metallurgist at MIT. And Antoine has been interested in the problem of getting potassium. He's found that he can remove potassium very effectively from rocks, specifically from feldspar, which is abundantly available. He's tested this idea in Brazil. We're supporting him to test it in Malawi. But it looks like a lower cost alternative to the production of potassium. And then finally, Kartish Mantiran is an assistant professor in chemical engineering. And he's been interested in producing ammonia fertilizers, but doing it by electrochemical means driven by photovoltaic panels. And he believes that he can convert atmospheric nitrogen to ammonia using a very low voltage, without the natural gas, in a distributed form that can be driven by solar power, thus removing a lot of the barriers to fertilization in the developing world. So another example of just taking a person who is not a fertilizer specialist, but who has a great idea that relates to it, and pulling him in to the problem. And that's a lot of what we do when we look for investigators. We're just trying to get brilliant people to think about a problem and see what they can do. We have this program for commercialization of technology. MIT is very interested in seeing how inventions can be converted into business opportunities and used to solve problems outside the institute. MIT faculty and alumni have founded 31,000 companies that are still operating today. These companies employ 4.9 million people, and they generate $1.9 trillion in annual revenue, which by itself would be the 9th largest GDP in the world between Russia and India, if it were a country. One of the projects we're looking at is related to using carbon nanotubes. Without getting into a lot of details, you can coat nanotubes so that they will bind to particular things in water. One coating will bind to mercury, another will bind to lead, another will bind to E. coli, another might bind to gluten or peanut enzymes. And so my colleague Michael Strano has been working to develop a device using an array of nanotubes with different coatings, perhaps put on a little microscope slide such as this. Each one of those dots would respond to a different thing. When you irradiate a carbon nanotube, it will fluoresce, and it will fluoresce with different intensity or different wavelength when things bind. And so he's working toward a simple handheld device, you might think of your mobile phone, where you could put a drop of water on this slide, and the readout from your phone would say, no mercury, no lead, but it has arsenic, no listeria, no E. coli, but it has salmonella. So you get a multiplex sensor. This is on its way to commercialization as a new company. I think I'm going to skip over the next one. We're doing some work on xylem filters in India. You can use little pieces of wood to filter bacteria and virus. And my colleague Rohit Karnik is testing this in Uttarakhand with the potential to impact 10 million people. We have a program, a lot of effort for student engagement. Our students really like to get involved with government, with industry, with companies, with researchers, and learn from them and talk to them. And so we have an MIT Water Club that the students organize and run. They hold weekly events. They have a major water summit every year. They also organize a Water Innovation Prize, which is a business plan competition. So these are, again, mostly students competing who have an idea for something that might treat or purify water. Perhaps it's based on the research they're doing or a class they've taken. And they write up a pitch as a company. They compete for funding. $30,000 in prizes are awarded in this event. It's sponsored by PepsiCo, by Xylem, by J-WAFS, and others. Give you a sense of one of the winning pitches was a device to find leaks in buried pipes. So about 30% of the water that goes into many pipelines is just leaked back into the ground. And it's often through very small leaks that you don't see on the surface. You know, a big pipe break that bursts through the pavement, that's really easy to find. But a little leak in a buried pipe is hard to get to. So they've been looking at a strategy of putting robots into pipelines so that they can actually have the robot traverse the pipe. They've worked on this through a couple of, well, through an entire doctoral thesis. There are about 14 patents around the technology at the moment. And the device is pretty simple. It's got a ring around the outside edge. If there's a little crack in the pipe, there's a pressure variation. That little ring flexes slightly, and they have an actuator that can detect deflection. So this was the winner this year. Again, they're very close to commercialization. They have some industrial partners who are looking at the patent family. The Water Summit that we hold each year is a 2-day event. There are panels on a variety of topics. We have typically 200 people who show up from various sectors. This year the event will be on November 7th and 8th. If any of you are in Boston, please do attend. It's always a great activity. We have a large number of seed grants. I'm not going to go through these as a catalog, but one of them is about stormwater management for urban settings. We're looking at managing stormwater with engineered wetlands. So how do you design retention basins that also have ecological functions? This work is being done in connection with Houston and Los Angeles. We have some work that's looking at the impact of coal-fired power plants on mercury transport. So coal, when you burn it, emits all kinds of stuff, right? One of the things that coal emits is mercury, elemental mercury, which is then transported atmospherically and it can be deposited. And when it lands in water, there is the potential for biological conversion from elemental mercury to methyl mercury. And methyl mercury is very strongly absorbed by plants. And in particular, a plant of concern is rice in China. And if you have methyl mercury being deposited, you find mercury in your rice, which is toxic. This is just a chart that the investigators developed. This is a joint project, by the way, between a faculty member in earth science and a faculty member in the Sloan School who's interested in regulation of mercury pollution. But you can see in green the regions in China where the level of mercury, total mercury in rice, is very high, above national standard levels. And you can see on the right in red the areas where deposition of mercury from power plants is very high. It's a very strong mapping. Their simulations show what's likely to happen in the absence of policy on the left, continuing rise in mercury in food, or with controls on coal emissions, substantial fall in mercury on food. One of the things we're very interested in is how science can guide policy decisions. We have some work about water sampling. Can you use simple dry cards to sample water instead of bottles of water? These investigators are developing essentially a polymer that can be placed on a card. You put a drop of water on it, you mail the card in. Their target in particular is rural India. The villages in India, many of them don't have very good connections back to the cities where the labs are. Moving that set of water bottles is a challenge. Getting the sample taken correctly is a challenge. And so the other branch of their project has been on the ground in India, in collaboration with the Tata Foundation, looking at what it would take to get this technology adopted. How do you know that somebody's going to use this card if you invent it? An invention that works in Cambridge, Massachusetts, is not necessarily a useful invention in India, but they have that part of the work underway as well. So that's a snapshot of the kinds of things we do, just to give you a sense of what our activity looks like. We're science, technology, and business driven. We're very oriented toward our students. Student engagement is entirely central to what we do. And I'm happy to answer questions if there are any.
Any questions?
Thanks for the presentation. I was actually very curious about there was one slide that you mentioned, I saw a Abdul, maybe, where they filter some water.
The piece of wood? Sure, I'll show you.
Can you talk a little bit more about it?
I was just trying to save time, not to conceal it. This one. Yeah, so xylem is a layer of the woody part of plants, like tree branches are actually entire trees. It's between the bark and then the central wood. And it's part of the mechanism by which plants transport water up and down the tree. So Rohit Karnik is a professor in mechanical engineering. He works in microfluidics and also in water filtration. And he made the observation that xylem has internal pore sizes that are just about right for removing bacteria and virus. And he did some work to look at what's needed. He found simple treatments that can be done to this wood, essentially to soak it in ethanol for a couple of days to prevent certain kinds of degradation from happening. He's done work to confirm the sampling. He's achieved log 4 removal. He's aiming toward log 6 with slightly thicker samples. And he's also done work to understand how long you can continue to use a little bit of wood before other degradation processes begin to make it unusable. The answer turns out to be something like 3 days, possibly up to a week, depending on your source water. What we are supporting Rohit and Amy Smith, who works in our development lab, she's a MacArthur Fellow, what we're supporting them to do is to come up with a design for this that can be so simple that it's a blueprint we release to the outside world.